but it's easier to hide my notes. The first question I want to address is whether or not Trump is an illiberal Democrat, similar to Orban, and I'll talk about why I don't think so. Secondly, I want to say that Trump is, in many ways, a traditional, racially nationalist Republican, but with all the constraints of the Republican superego taken off. That is, he's explicitly racist rather than a dog whistle racist. And then I want to talk about the turn to the far right among those left behind by globalization, cosmopolitanism, immigration, and the fact that, and I will define the term, that the neoliberal turn in social democracy, as Sherry Berman said in the New York Times a while ago, means that there is no real left alternative for people to turn to, and we have to talk about reconstructing a left alternative. And neoliberalism I would define by the 4 Ds: deregulation, deunionization, defunding the welfare state by upwardly redistributive tax cuts and decreasing public goods and privatizing them, plus repression with those excluded from the labor market under neoliberalism. But in any event, is Trump an illiberal Democrat? That is, as Sherry talked about earlier, he favors democratic elections. He's a plebiscitarian president elected by the people, by the plebes. He supports property rights, but is he really totally hostile to civil rights? I think he is in his heart, but I think US institutions are strong enough that we're not going to see Orban or Putin or Erdogan or Modi ruling, the Trumpian equivalent ruling. I could be wrong, but I think at this point there's been a lot of pushback, and hopefully there will be more pushback, and also, except maybe on trade, and I don't think he will really end up implementing very nationalist trade policies. He's basically following a traditional Republican agenda, which I think is vulnerable because it is now so obviously plutocratic, and really how can you do trickle down for a third time? I mean, maybe. But we don't have a cartelized party structure where the dominant party is really repressing the minority party. We don't have total state control over the media. We don't have political control of the bureaucracy, although it is true that Trump is appointing a lot of bureaucrats who want to destroy or decrease the capacity of their departments, that is, DeVos at Education, Carson at HUD, whoever's replaced Price at HHS, and obviously Priebus at the EPA. But he hasn't purged the civil service, or he hasn't disobeyed court orders as much as he may rail against the judiciary. But that doesn't mean he isn't dangerous. First of all, he does harass the media. Even if he's not a fascist or an illiberal Democrat, totally, he's given space for to the far right, overtly white nationalists via the appointments of Bannon, Sessions, and Stephen Miller. But if this were fascism, I think we have to be very careful. There would be many more organized paramilitaries in the street. There would be total smashing of unions, and this meeting would be broken up. So, I mean, we have to be somewhat careful as to what we define. But the threat of Trump is serious enough. In a certain sense, Trump won because traditional Republicans came home to him. He got 92% of the traditional Republican vote. He swung some key white working class and lower middle class votes in key industrial states, but really Trump was able to hold together the Republican coalition, which at the presidential level, because of voter suppression, because of mobilization of the politics of racial resentment, it can achieve a plurality large enough to win the Electoral College. Just an aside, we do have to take swing white working class voters very seriously because the heartland is predominantly white. And it's very hard to govern from the left if we only control the bi-coastal areas where the left is somewhat strong still. But we forget that from the politics of Nixon and law and order to even the politics of the 1966 congressional race against busing and school integration, the right has really played on a racial politics of resentment for a long time. Reagan opened his 1980 campaign in the Neshoba County Fair in Philadelphia, Mississippi, just 15 years after Goodman, Schwerner, and Traney were killed there, and his campaign was to turn back the civil rights revolution, and he said that affirmative action has gone too far. But while Trump may be a Republican redux in a certain way, he's a nationalist in ways that more cosmopolitan, pro-corporate Republicans are not. He's not a free trader, and he's not into multilateral foreign policy. But whether or not we can turn that on its head and somehow use this for progressive means, it's very doubtful. Now, why was the revolt against the Second Reconstruction so powerful? And I would argue that really since the mid-1970s, neither party has done much to address the ravages of deindustrialization. That's affected many black and Latino workers, obviously, but given the racial dynamics of American politics, they have nowhere to go. If they do vote, they're going to vote Democratic, because the Republican Party really is in many ways a white nativist party. 92% of its vote comes from Anglos, right? 92% of its vote nationally. Whereas the Democrats derive 48% of their vote from blacks, Latinos, Asian Americans, Native Americans. I think 4 decades of wage stagnation does add up. I don't want to say that, I mean, most white working class people and most working class people in general don't vote because they don't really see elites being responsive. But and it's also true that the political science stats show that whites from families who earn under $35,000 a year still vote majority Democratic. But it's families between 40 and 70,000, particularly in deindustrialized areas, that have swung to the Republicans. But when somebody promises to do something for working class people, they do respond. Obama won 50% of white workers' votes in 45% in 2008, partly because of the Great Recession, but also because he did talk about jobs, even if he didn't do much about it once in office. In 2012, he got enough votes, probably the low 40s, in the industrial Midwest to win Ohio by 8 points. Hillary loses Ohio by 8 points. That's a huge swing. And he also wins enough white working class votes in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania to win fairly easily in all those states. Wisconsin was somewhat close. And why? Because of the auto bailout. And the fact that Romney opposed the auto bailout, that he saved hundreds of thousands of auto part jobs and auto jobs, and the fact that Romney was incredibly plutocratic, right? Romney talked about the takers and the makers, but he comes off as part of the elite. Trump, in his own sort of inherited wealth, etc., comes off as sort of a nouveau riche and gauche, and sort of more kind of American in sort of a standard sort of definition. I mean, Romney's clearly, though Mormon, is clearly a private school kid, whatever. Now, I think, in conclusion, I think Sherry Berman's correct that you need a social democratic revival to stem the far right. But here I think we have to admit that the governing model of the Keynesian welfare state really can no longer work in one nation. One of the big reasons for the growth of the far right in Europe is that basically there isn't solidarity. You could have a social democratic mixed market economy in all of Europe, no doubt about it. It's a huge market. It has a stable currency, etc. But if you don't have as well a fiscal union as well as monetary union, you can't have it. And if you have Germans who really believe in a bipartisan way in fiscal austerity, it's incredibly difficult to reflate the Southern European economies. And it's not just Spain and Portugal and Greece that have massive unemployment. The Italian economy is very weak and very indebted, and it's going to need relief from that debt if it's going to be able to grow. Now, the good news, though, is, and I'll conclude with this, and it's somewhat the Sanders campaign, the United States is the one country where probably standard social democratic welfare state policies can work. Why? We're in a market of 320 million people. 2, we control a global currency, which if there was a big run on it, the Chinese would be in deep trouble. So in a certain sense, debtor nations can have some leverage if they have an international currency. We only channel 36% of our GDP through the public sector. Britain is next at 40. The Germans are about 45. France, actually, because they have universal paid childcare, parental leave, and healthcare, channels 52% of its GDP through the public sector. And none of those countries spend what we spend on defense or mass incarceration. This is an incredibly rich country whose resources, as Mark Levinson said earlier in the question, is redistributed upwards in an incredibly plutocratic way. I mean, there's a lot of political science now. Political science is a very moderate field politically, but there are a lot of behavioral American political scientists who look at public policy and voting who say that policy today is more responsive on things like trade, taxes, social welfare, healthcare, more responsive to the preferences of the 1% than to the preferences of the median voter, the average voter. So Sanders didn't fall from the sky. There is a sort of both right-wing resentment of political elites and plutocrats, but also a left-wing resentment. Now, I think the key thing, though, is, and I don't know about the red baiting. I don't know if Sanders would have beaten Trump. We can't test counterfactuals. But the one thing that would have been all over the map is still the key thing, among white working class and middle class voters, is the charge that the Democrats tax and spend and redistribute to them. It's a very racially charged rhetoric. But it's also not totally crazy in that our tax system is very regressive. And there really has not been progressive tax reform since, well, Obama raised the top rates, but that was about it. Unless we can really handle the tax question and really say that our tax system is so rigged in favor of the rich and corporations, we're not going to win. And unless we also say that racism and racially divisive politics has caused working class people of all races to suffer economically, unless we really call out Republican racial politics, I don't think we really can win, because just talking about universal programs, and I'll conclude with this, isn't enough when people ask how will we pay for them, and they're not sure we're going to pay for them in a progressive way. I think the tax issue is wildly underestimated as an issue we have to take on. But it's not an impossible issue. Minnesota's moved in progressive directions on taxation. California's gone from very regressive tax reform to progressive tax reform. I think people realize, and I'll conclude with this, and this is Occupy, and this is sort of millennials, and this is the Sandwich phenomenon. Lots of young people and old people reaching retirement realize they cannot survive economically. They cannot survive economically unless public goods are expanded. They don't have pensions, they don't have private pensions, they don't have private savings, they're heavily indebted after college, it's not clear they have career track jobs. That's why I think universal health care, Medicare for all, actually will be a viable issue, and I think an issue that will play a big role in the 2018 and 2020 elections. So to finally wrap up, we have to have a social democratic revival, but we have to realize that the racialization of US politics is probably the biggest barrier to that social democratic revival. Thank you very much.